It was a crisp autumn night, and James, a quiet man in his mid-30s, found himself pacing through the empty streets. He had always been a night owl, but tonight something felt different. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the deserted town, while the soft rustling of fallen leaves seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. His cat, Luna, trotted beside him, her sleek black fur nearly blending into the shadows. James smiled faintly at the comforting sound of her paws padding against the pavement. Luna had been his companion for years, and even on the loneliest nights, she was always by his side. Tonight, however, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It started as a vague uneasy flicker in the corner of his eye, a distant scraping sound behind them, but soon it escalated. The air grew colder, and the once calm atmosphere seemed to shift, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Luna, usually so composed, began to act strange, her tail flicking nervously as she glanced into the darkened alleyways. "Come on." "Luna," James muttered, trying to brush off the creeping fear. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The streets were too quiet. The houses they passed, usually warm and inviting during the day, now stood like hollow sentinels, their windows dark and empty, as if the world had abandoned them. James paused, scanning the shadows. He could have sworn he saw something move in the distance, a dark figure just out of reach of the streetlight. His heart rate quickened, but when he looked again, it was gone. "Maybe we should head back," James suggested aloud to Luna, who responded with a low growl. Her eyes locked on something in the distance. Before he could take a step, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, sending a chill through his spine. The air grew thicker, heavier, and the wind began to howl. Someone was near. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, as the shadows around him seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like tendrils reaching for him. A low whisper floated through the air, faint but unmistakable. It came from all directions at once, a voice he couldn't quite understand, but it carried a sense of malevolent intent. Luna hissed, her fur bristling as she arched her back. The sound of her fur standing on end sent a jolt of terror through James, but he couldn't bring himself to move. It was as though his body was frozen, unwilling to turn away from the unseen horror slowly encroaching on them. Out of nowhere, a cold gust of wind swept through the alley, lifting leaves from the ground and sending them swirling into a dark vortex. The vortex seemed to grow larger and larger until it reached out, almost beckoning them to step forward. James felt a sudden compulsion to pull towards the center of the storm, a desire to follow the darkness. But Luna, her eyes wide with fear, refused to move. Her body was rigid, and she let out a loud yowl, a desperate cry for help. James snapped out of his trance, heart pounding in his chest. "Luna, let's go," he shouted, grabbing her in his arms and stumbling backward, away from the terrifying force that seemed to beckon. But it was too late. The shadows were closing in on them. From the corner of his eye, James saw the figure again this time. It was unmistakable. A tall, gaunt shape, its features obscured by a cloak of shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two piercing orbs that seemed to watch his every movement. Luna's fur stood on end, her growls turning to frantic meows as the figure advanced. James turned and ran, carrying Luna in his arms, but the shadows seemed to follow them, creeping along the ground like living entities, whispering in a language he couldn't comprehend. His heart raced as he sprinted down the street, the sound of footsteps too heavy to be his own coing behind him. He didn't dare look back. All he could hear was the roar of wind, the howling whispers, and Luna's frantic meows in his ear. Finally, James reached his front door, fumbling with the keys in his hands. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent, and the darkness seemed to press against him, as though trying to drag him back into its cold embrace. With one last effort, he unlocked the door and shoved it open, slamming it shut behind him. Just as the shadows reached his heels, his heart was racing, and his hands shook uncontrollably as he bolted the door, trying to keep whatever horrors were lurking outside at bay. Luna leaped from his arms, darting under the nearest chair and staring. At the door, her body tense. The room was silent, except for the pounding of James's heart. The shadows were gone. The whispers had stopped, but the fear remained as he sat in the silence of his home. James realized that whatever he had encountered that night wasn't over. He could still feel the cold weight of the unseen forces pressing in on him.